Hello and welcome to Talking Reds, a brand new Nottingham Forest podcast hosted by myself, Greg Oram, and my fellow Forest fan from across the Atlantic, Richard Spray. Live from Oklahoma. How you doing, Richard?
Oh, I'm doing really good, man. Thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. If you're finding us for the first time, welcome to the channel. And if you've been here before, then welcome back. Coming up later, we will have the latest Nottingham Forest news, Richard's lightning round, and also we will be going through Tom Cartledge's interview on Forest Focus. But first, amongst all the furore surrounding a potential new stadium and exit from West Bridgford for Nottingham Forest, a week or so ago, our guest today was featured online in the Nottingham Evening Post, where his detailed design and vision for a brand new city ground caused quite a reaction from the fan base. To talk to us about this and the wider picture around the city ground, we are delighted to be joined by architect Matthew Drewitt. Matthew, welcome to the channel. How are you?
Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be invited on, and I'm extremely passionate about the club and the city ground and the future of the club, both on and off the pitch. So excited to discuss the plans with you.
Fantastic. So before we get into that, you just tell us a little bit more about yourself so we could get to know you just a little bit more.
So my Forest story is perhaps different to a lot of your listeners. We were talking just before we came on air, and I'm not actually a Forest fan. I'm a Fulham fan. But I studied in Nottingham over 10 years ago. I fell in love with the city then, and I had a fantastic time at university here and moved back down to my native London for 5 years, where I worked in a large practice in London. Incidentally, Richard, they also had an office in Oklahoma City.
Wow.
So
great.
Sadly, never got to visit, but it's not ruling it out in the future. And during the pandemic, I moved back to Nottingham and I joined a sports and leisure practice in the city, and have since moved on to another practice fairly recently. So my Forest story, I guess, revolves around my move back to the city and my best friend, who is also a massive supporting Forest fan and fellow architect. We watched the season under Houghton and then subsequently Cooper when you went back into obviously the Premier League, and I was in the Trent Navy the day you got promoted, and it was just fantastic seeing fans in their 60s, 70s and younger fans, those that had seen European Cup wins and seasons in League One. So quite a variety of fans, and some that had never known Premier League football, and the emotion attached to the promotion and the ambition that's followed has inspired me, and I think lots of other people who live in the city. And it's just so fantastic to have the club back in the Premier League. So, moving on to the stadium and how that came about, my best friend and I used to talk about it over lunch times. And when we visited the city ground, we were fortunate enough to go to a few games towards the end of that fantastic season in the Championship. And we often toyed with the idea of, expansion. And I think it became quite clear that the plans for the Peter Taylor stand, which came about at a time when Forest were probably flirting with League One rather than the Premier League, I think they were very ambitious. And, the club, the chairman, whose, practice brought forward those plans should be, highly commended for getting that through the planning process. And I think at that time it was very ambitious, taking the capacity up to 35,000 with a view to maybe look at further expansions. But I think the goalposts have changed since Forest have got into the Premier League. I think the owners' ambitions have moved forward. And I think all of those things are fantastic. And I think the chairman shares those ambitions as well. Hence the debate around the stadium. And so we looked at a number of options, very high level, about expanding the current site. And we toyed with the idea of fiddling around with the current stadium. We know how much of a challenge the Peter Taylor stand was for Benoit, the chairman's architectural practice and the club, and they led a very successful planning application, which was granted a couple of years ago. And that obviously has a shelf life. And as I said before, the goalposts have moved. We also considered the Clough stand and the Trent and the Bridgeford stand. And it sort of all really pointed towards the same conclusion, that actually expanding that footprint in its current form is very challenging. And people talk about doing an Anfield style main stand on the Brian Clough, adding a third tier. And it's very easy to draw things, and they work physically from a plan perspective or in a section, or you feel like it's possible, but the reality sometimes is quite different, and it can be quite challenging to justify those moves financially, etc., etc. So there are lots of different factors which come into the viability of making some of those moves. And that led us to this idea of exploring rotating the pitch and actually trying to get a super stadium on that site. And so we toyed around with a number of positions, and I think we actually went away and researched stadiums around the UK and the world. I think it's interesting, the question of pitch orientation has come about in the last few days. I understand that FIFA have guidance, and it is just that, it is guidance. But I would, draw people's attention to the fact that Anfield, Old Trafford, Brentford, the King Power, Huddersfield Town, Coventry City, Norwich, Croke Park all follow that orientation. And looking more widely, the Parc des Princes, San Siro, the Ataturk in Turkey. And some of those stadiums have, as recently as last year, have hosted a Champions League final. Some of those are UEFA 5-star stadiums, and they can be made to work. I would also draw people's attention to the guidance and how it was applied by Foster and Partners when they were looking at Wembley. So Wembley, being, I would say, the most famous stadium in the world, possibly alongside the Camp Nou and the Bernabeu, as well as others. But, everyone in the world probably has heard of Wembley and knows Wembley Stadium. And that is an east-west orientation. So it flies in the face of all the guidance. But Foster and Partners managed to make it work by looking at the roof and the design of the stadium so that the challenges around sunlight could be met, because that ultimately is what that guidance is there for. It's to stop an unfair advantage and sunlight going into players' eyes. So there's lots of different factors at play. Orientation is one debate we can have, but I think more generally speaking, we need to perhaps ask the right questions when we're talking about the City Ground site. And what I mean by that is, we quite often ask questions around parking and drainage and flooding and all of these various factors. And if we put roadblocks in the way, then we're going to end up at the same conclusion, which is that it can't be done. Whereas I believe strongly that it can be done, and with the right will and determination, those challenges can be met. And we can go into detail in a few minutes about other examples of where I think those challenges have been met. And I'd be keen to discuss that, because I think it's useful to fall back on precedents and examples of that elsewhere in the UK and the world.
Fantastic. So by the looks of things, your vision is to flatten what we've got at the moment and build again. And you've provided some images to the post, which we've got here as well. So whenever you're ready, I'll bring them up. And if you're able to talk us through your vision, and the questions I suppose are on the table is, how would we go about doing this? What kind of cost implications would be involved? You mentioned about some of the planning restrictions and the drainage, all those kind of questions that I guess need to be answered. The floor is yours, and you just tell me when you want me to move the slides along. So if I bring the first one up for you.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, so the site plan is a good place to start. And I think really the stadium that we and I latterly worked up was for a much larger stadium capacity than the one that the chairman and the ownership are currently vying for, which I believe is 50,000. So this is for a much larger stadium. And the stadium plan here is actually a roof extents plan, and it's a high level sketch. And I think that's something when, you know, a vision is released, we have to view it as high level. You know, I'm a one-man band doing this in my evenings and trying to give an idea of what could be and a shopping list, rather than saying, here's a fully resolved scheme and, you know, stick it in the planning system tomorrow and we'll have it on site in a year. You know, it's not that. But it has been thought through. That's the key message here. And I honestly think that, you know, if we're going for a 50,000, that this scheme could work. So, you know, when we talk about the site plans, you know, some of the criticisms I've read on forums, on Twitter, Facebook, etc., online is about pinch points and ingress and egress and green guide, etc., etc. And yes, all of those things are very relevant, but you know, I would draw people's attention to Herzog de Meuron's scheme for Chelsea Football Club at Stamford Bridge. The Chelsea site is an incredibly challenging one. It's got 2 railways, it's got a southern main line and an underground running next to it. If you've ever been to Stamford Bridge, you'll know, you know, how busy it is on a match day. And I think it's about 43,000 at the moment. And Herzog managed to get a 60,000+ seater capacity stadium on that site successfully through planning. Now, it hasn't been delivered for various reasons, but the key is that they managed to get a successful granting of planning permission on that site. And, you know, they're working within boundaries of 8 to 10 meters away from some of the richest areas in London. So, you know, if the challenges can be met there, then I think they can be met elsewhere. And I certainly think they can be met here in Nottingham. What we looked at and what I latterly drew up was this idea of, you know, setting the stadium away from the properties to the south. Now, interestingly, if the planning information is correct, and I'm sure it is, the club actually owns some of the houses on Colic Road, which in the scheme I drew up is just below Garibaldi Way. And lots of the properties in that part of Bridgeford are actually rentals. There are, of course, some people who own their properties there, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, you know, it's obviously a hot topic, you know, the neighborhood and the neighborly relations the club has. But I think people who live in Rushcliffe generally accept that it's a hub of sport in the county. You know, you've got Trent Bridge, the City Ground, you've got Meadow Lane just across the water, you've got Home Pierpoint, which is the home of the National Water Sports Centre, you've got rugby fields and sports fields on the opposite side of Lady Bay. So this sports stadium is not exclusive. This area is known for being a hub of sport. So you don't buy a property in West Bridgeford or Rushcliffe without that in mind. Now, of course, it's different when you live on a street adjacent to a football stadium. Granted, I appreciate that. But I think we need to look at the wider arguments about the reasons for retaining the stadium where it is. I just think that location is so integral, not just to West Bridgeford, Rushcliffe, but the city and the region and how it's perceived. You know, that view as you come over Trent Bridge is just so iconic. I think there are very few other views in world football of stadiums that have such an iconic place in a city. We talk about soulless bowls and moving to a car park, you know, 7 miles outside of a city centre. And it happens in loads of cities all over the world. It happens all over Europe and beyond. And I just think that's not the right approach. And I think there are so many examples in major cities where stadiums are retained in their original location. Look at Anfield. You know, yes, Anfield has had a lot of space around it for the main stand to back into. Appreciated. This is a tight site. But I refer people to Brentford's new stadium, to Spurs, to Stamford Bridge. You know, these are major stadiums, and the two latterly, Spurs and Chelsea, over 60,000. That have either successfully got planning permission or have been delivered. And it's getting back to that that point I made earlier about if we put roadblocks in the way to the questions, then we're asking the wrong questions. You know, we need to be asking, how can we make moving 50,000 people in and out of a stadium less disruptive to neighbours? And that's about better infrastructure. That's about managing flows of people, etc., etc. So if we look at the site plan, we've set the stadium away from those residential properties to the south. Currently, the Bridgeford stand is almost, you can almost touch it from the windows of those properties on Colwick Road. You know, if you put your hand out the window, you can almost touch the edge of the stadium. We've tried to create an access road down there. And I drew inspiration actually from Herzog's plans for Stamford Bridge, where underneath the rake of the first tier, they had created additional access. So you can't read this plan as the building, you know, hits the ground at the lines that are on there. Actually, you know, you can create additional space and concourse space at ground level to help with flows of people, etc., etc. And the technicalities of that, I believe, can be met, and they've been met elsewhere. There are many stadiums that have a close relationship with residential areas. And I think that's the trade-off of having a stadium in a densely populated city. That's a debate for another day. I think if we look more widely, I've tried to take inspiration on the riverside, so where the Trent is. If you look at what Fulham achieved at Craven Cottage, they actually borrowed, if you like, some of the Thames to build out the riverside stand. That was an idea. And if you ever go down to the City Ground on match day, you'll know what it's like. You get thousands of people piling down the banks of the Trent, and the launches for the rowing clubs, you know, the banks, the grass banks, they're quite steep, and you often see people kind of tumbling down to get round to the clough stand, and it's all a bit clumsy. And I think that part of this scheme would actually improve the interface between the stadium and the riverfront, not just for match day spectators or people who are going to see a gig or another, you know, sports event at the stadium, but on a day-to-day basis for people who want to go for a walk along the Trent. You know, this would be a brand new towpath and riverside walk. You can imagine bars and cafes spilling out onto that terrace. It'd be fantastic. And if you know Nottingham well, you'll know that we have this fantastic river. And actually, the city in many ways turns its back on the river. You know, you've got County Hall, you've got the City Ground, but for vast majorities and stretches along there isn't a great deal of activity. And so I think moving the City Ground would sort of rip the heart out of the city. And it's one of the jewels in Nottingham's crown. So getting back to the plan then, you know, what we've done is expanded what is currently the Brian Clough stand. It would actually be an end in these plans into the car park. And created 4 squares around the edge of the stadium to increase the concourse space. And the relationship between the riverfront, as I've mentioned before, I've drawn inspiration from Fulham, but we can also look at the Principality Stadium in Wales, which is the national stadium in Wales, and it runs on the River Taff. And the River Taff at that point is much, much less wider than the Trent is here. Even with this creep into the Trent that, you know, I've notionally drawn. And again, it's a line on a page. It's not a resolved plan, but it could be made to work. I truly believe that. The Thames is obviously wider, but, you know, you see criticisms of the pier and the pontoon. You know, there are all sorts of manners in which the pontoon could just be drawn back in to the bank when it's not being used, etc., etc. And again, it's sort of, people put up smoke screens and roadblocks to all of the ideas. It's a shopping list, and I'm not saying every single one of them has to happen. They're just ideas, but I truly believe that we can make it work, and with the right will, a plan of this nature could be made to work. yes, we might need to look at, you know, some of the intricacies of how this design has been drawn. It's just a sketch, but there are very many opportunities, I believe, to make it work. So if we go to the next slide, this is taken from the other side of the Trent, so Trent Bridge Quays, which is a new residential development. And again, it sort of taps into that idea of, you know, creating an interface between the Trent and the city and building on that relationship, which the residential properties that are going along the Trent and will continue to be built along the Trent, probably on both sides eventually, this will enhance that. And I truly believe that, you know, if you move the stadium anywhere else from the city ground, then it really will rip the heart out of this portion of the city, and it actually loses that quality that makes it so special. It's not common for a football stadium to be on the river. It's a really, really special location and should be preserved. And when we talk about the architecture, again, the architecture had some thinking behind it, of course, but it was a high level, you know, let's throw an envelope on the building and let's explore some opportunities. The thinking behind the red brick portions from the ground up to the second tier, you know, references similar instances, really. If you look at Aston Villa's new proposal, or the two new stands that have been built at Anfield, or the new Everton stadium, there's a link back to Archibald Lech, who was a Scottish architect and designed most of the UK's stadiums in the early portions of the 1900s. And so that charm of a traditional four-sided stadium was what I was trying to tap into there, as well as the industrial heritage of the Midlands, red brick, and linking more widely to the city. You know, when you come out of Nottingham Station, it's a wonderful red brick terracotta building. It's spectacular. And you turn left and you go down and you start to walk along the canal and the towpath, and then you see the city ground emerge from, you know, behind Trent Bridge. It's tapping into all of those links. And that's that view we're talking about from the bank side. And if you go to the next one, that's the view from Trent Bridge. And you can see how it just slightly eats into the Trent, but it actually lines through with the existing bank. So all we're doing there is really just raising the ground level. We can work around issues with height. If you look at Manchester City, so the City of Manchester Stadium was an athletic stadium, and Arup Engineering came up with a very clever scheme to actually drop the new first tier below ground, which is something that West Ham haven't done, and draws a lot of criticism from fans, because it doesn't feel like a traditional football stadium. But, you know, if we needed to bring the height down, we could look at that, water table dependent, etc., etc. But all of these ideas need to be explored. Then if we go to the next one, it's about creating a relationship between the existing residential area, so tapping into some of that local vernacular, that language, red brick, etc., and a more contemporary third tier, which uses glulam, timber, tree column beams, and CLT, all referencing, let's be honest, the most obvious icon, forest. It's a tree, forest and trees. And you know, my favorite stadium designers are an architectural practice called Populous. They're probably most famous at the moment for having worked on the Spurs stadium, very accomplished stadia design firm. And they brought forward proposals a couple of years ago for the cathedral, which was to be a new San Siro. And I love this idea they brought forward of trees enveloping the stadium, and it's almost like the stadium's within a forest. And so I thought, why can't we do that here? You know, this feels absolutely the right thing to be doing. And of course, you know, you don't need to have loads of trees on the terrace. It's an idea. And of course, there'll be manicured, and the trees that are selected, you know, et cetera, need to be drawn on the heritage of the club. And that's why I mentioned about the trees at Sherwood Forest, and perhaps bringing some of the saplings there and growing them at the ground, et cetera, so we can build on all the heritage that surrounds the club and the region more widely. And if we go to the next one, you know, that highlights the view from Colic Road, and actually opening that up to the residential streets to the south, which is, in my view, is the traditional English football experience. You know, as a Fulham fan, when Fulham are playing and you walk from Putney Bridge through Bishop's Park, or you approach from other directions, you're walking down traditional terrace streets. It's such a common sight. It's the same at Anfield and many other stadiums. And I think that view is just so sacrosanct to English football and should be preserved at all costs. But you can see there how the base of the stadium fits in with the townscape, and then this more contemporary architecture emerges above. And we've tried notionally to reference the waves in Forest's crest. You know, whether that flies or not, who knows? But it's an idea again.
I love it, by the way. Sorry, I've got to tell you, I love that bit.
I agree. Yep.
We're sold. Keep going. We're completely sold. It looks amazing.
Thank you. And then, you know, if we go to the next one, this is the view from Scarrington Road, which, you know, I was unlucky in some ways to be at the Fulham game when you absolutely hammered us. Actually a terrifying experience being in the away end, I have to say, but very fun nonetheless, even when we're on the end of quite a drubbing. But, you know, that experience as an away fan, and this corner of the stadium housing the museum and a museum of Nottingham and celebrating the heritage of the area, so that as an away fan, you learn more about the place you're visiting and why the club is, you know, the army for the city, is the army for the region. And I've described Nottingham Forest Football Club as the exhibition window to the world. You know, Nottingham is a fantastic city, and Nottinghamshire is a fantastic region. And we've just got a new East Midlands mayor, and I'm sure she'll do a fantastic job of promoting us on the global stage. But there are very few things coming out of Nottingham that have quite as much an impact as going out to billions of people every week watching Premier League football. Nottingham is hitting households in every corner of the earth. And so when people are lucky enough to come and visit the ground, it's about celebrating that and about telling the story more widely around Clough, Peter Taylor, the history of the European Cup winning days, the fact that it was a workers' club to begin with, and the history of the city and the region, capturing that and celebrating that, so that even if you're not a football fan, you can come and experience the ground and experience the club and appreciate its value in other ways. So if we go to the next one. So this was the idea of a traditional four-sided stadium. Of course, the conundrum is, how do you fill in the corners? The current Bridgeford stand almost goes some way to doing that, similar to Old Trafford with a curvy corner. Stamford Bridge, Everton, various other clubs have looked at this kind of Shamford approach, and we could debate all of this and whether it's got a single tier. You know, I had an idea for a sort of Dortmund style yellow wall, or a Spurs style single tier. I think Everton are doing the same at their new ground, and I think that's a wonderful idea. And how this ground can be used for commercial purposes. So, you know, we talked about orientation earlier and sunlight. I mean, it's, what is it now, the 25th of May, and I'm looking outside and it's grey clouds and the football season's finished. So, you know, sometimes the question of sunlight is a bit over-egged. But, you know, we can look at various grounds. Warsaw National Stadium springs to mind as having a retractable PTFE roof. So in conditions where sunlight is a problem or inclement weather, that roof can be drawn and protect players, protect occupants inside the stadium, as well as making it a stadium that can be used throughout the week for conferences, for gigs, for various other sports activities. I spoke to Sarah at the time. We've got a growing tennis competition in Nottingham, which is actually becoming a bit of a prerequisite to Wimbledon now. It's becoming quite popular. Mm-hmm. Why couldn't the final of that be played in the city ground? You know, and we make that an event, and we make other sports events take place, the finals in this ground. Before my sort of age, I think, I don't recall it anyway. You know, FA Cup semi-finals and quarter-finals and League Cup finals used to be played all over the country. And, you know, this could be a venue. Likewise, it could be a venue to host a Champions League final, or if England or the UK and Ireland ever go in for another World Cup bid, this could be one of the venues. We have to think ambitiously about what this stadium could be. You can see there at the back, there's an idea for a skywalk. Spurs have got one. Barcelona are planning one, I believe, at the Camp Nou, or at least I've seen renders of it. Whether it actually happens, I'm not sure. But there's an idea of a bronzed Robin Hood overlooking the pitch. And I think, Robin Hood is, when people think of Nottingham, they think of Nottingham Forest and Robin Hood. Everyone knows Nottingham for those two things. And when you're in the stadium on match day, there's a small segment in that famous 10-minute or so video that plays before the team walk out and Mull of Kintyre. And it's just about bringing that and celebrating that in a way that hasn't been celebrated before. I've even got a wild idea about, I love Mull of Kintyre. I think it's just glorious, and it's up there for me with You'll Never Walk Alone. It's really soul stirring, especially when you've got 28,000 Forest fans singing it in the stadium. It's just incredible. When you stand outside the stadium on match day, you can hear it from about 2 to 3 miles away. It's that loud. It is incredible. And I can't imagine what 50,000 of you singing it would sound like. But I've got this idea for trumpet militaire in the stadium. So bagpipes that actually, play alongside Mull of Kintyre to really intensify the atmosphere. Although that's probably a bit of a crazy idea, but
no, it's not. We love it. Keep going.
There's so many things we can do, so many ideas we can explore. And I think, why not be ambitious? This city is fantastic. This region is fantastic. And this, for me, could be the beginning of a new era for this part of the country. And if we get this right, and I know that the chairman and I know that the owner are fully on board with that vision, these kind of ideas and more, I think we should explore. So if we go to the next one, I think that's, again, just another sort of internal of that view overlooking the pitch. And you can see some of those ideas there being celebrated, like the waves in the crest in the roof form, etc., etc., etc. And if we go to the next one, what we were trying to pick out here, what I was trying to pick out here on the elevation, is tapping into the club's heritage and creating an architecture that the club can be proud of. One of the criticisms I have more generally of more contemporary stadiums is that they are a bit boring, they are a bit soulless. And I understand cost has a big factor to play in that. Some people love contemporary architecture and think that, harking back to more traditional forms and styles of architecture is a bad thing. Personally, I take a more balanced approach. I think it needs to be a bit more 50-50. And I think where the ground condition is and the way people experience it at ground level, I think it needs to remind people that there is a permanence, and the club has been on that site for a long time. And it also needs to tap into the historic values of the club and the region, etc. We've in both those main stands, if you like, I've tried to capture I think the most important moment in Forest history, which is when you won 2 Champions Leagues. And I think you guys are really humble about that. It's amazing. You have 2 Champions League trophies. There are teams that
consecutive
back to back. It is one of, if not the greatest story in football, and is just not celebrated enough. And you forgive me for saying this, but it's a bit like when Leicester won the Premier League. As a football fan, you've just got to appreciate that was incredible. I was up here at the time, and I remember it when it happened, and it was amazing. We were all in that moment. It was just so fantastic to see a team that, well, and this is no criticism of Manchester City, but that wasn't Manchester City winning, or a Liverpool. Mm-hmm. And I think, Forest did that at a time when they were perhaps less fashionable. So we've captured, or I've captured that in the elevation, and tried to make way for your European Cups immortalized in terracotta, just to remind everyone. And also, I think psychologically, I've studied a lot the psychology of architecture, and metaphysicality is the word I use to describe it. When fantastic footballers sign for big clubs, one of the first things they do is they walk them out onto the pitch in the stadium, and it's a vacuous space, and it's just to remind them that you are playing for a big club. So when you put on that shirt, when you wear that badge over your heart, you need to deliver, and you're not being brought in to do a job just to keep us up, or this stadium could be that object. It has that psychological impact. When players are thinking about, who do I sign for? Yes, money is obviously a big factor in that. We all know that. But also, it's the stadium, it's the fan experience, it's all of those things. And we shouldn't shy away from the fact Forest are a massive club. They're a juggernaut. Yes, they've been, let's just say, off the boil for 20 or so years, but you're back now. You're back in the big time. I think you're here to stay. And I think you could probably follow the same trajectory as Villa, and I really hope that you do. So that's a little bit on the lower portions of the building. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see a sort of section cut through the Trent, and you can see obviously the idea for the pier pontoon there. Now there's a very famous boat that runs up and down the Trent called the Nottingham Princess. I've been fortunate enough to go on it a few times. And all of the canal boats that run through the city up towards Beeston, etc., etc. There's a rich heritage around that, and I've seen videos. Forza Garibaldi, I think it was a couple of years ago. They had all of the canal boats down on the Trent with pyrotechnics, etc., etc., and it just creates this most fantastic electric atmosphere as you're coming over Trent Bridge going into the stadium. It's a great experience, even if you're not a Forest fan. It's just a spectacle. Why can't we have that every week? People arriving by boat, there could be a park and ride somewhere down the river and people are getting, Uber boats like you do in London. Why not? Let's explore it. And also it's a commercial opportunity for the club. If you're celebrating a big birthday or celebrating something else and you think, right, I'm going to hire one of these little floating event spaces on the Trent, and Nottingham Forest's hospitality team are serving you dinner on the Trent, you're floating next to the stadium, that's going to mean a lot to a lot of people. And Fulham were looking at a similar idea, which is kind of where I borrowed that thinking from. And I don't see why Forest should feel any less ambitious than a Big Six club. Because in my opinion, you are. You are a big club. So why not be ambitious? And you can see there how the terrace, if you like, that we've sort of crept into the Trent ever so slightly there, can be used throughout the week for markets. It could be a towpath, a cycle path, and actually be really well loved and well used by residents, not just in Rushcliffe, but from all over the city. And you can imagine cafes, bars, restaurants, as I said before, spilling out onto that terrace. And again, all of these things, all of these ideas are ideas I had to generate the club revenue. And I think when we get back to the debate about Toton or anywhere else in the city, is it going to have the same appeal as this location? I would argue probably not. And whilst we're on that topic, before I forget, I've seen a lot of plans where the existing city ground and other grounds have been dropped and populated by various people on forums, on Twitter, etc. On the Lady Bay side, just on the other side of the bridge, further down Home Pier Point, down on the Wilford Power Station site, etc., etc. With some of those sites, they're all in floodplains. They're in flood zone 3. And I've worked in floodplains before, and flood zone 3 is the worst. It's the worst category. And again, it's not to say it's not a roadblock, but we have to be realistic about what you would need to do to try and build a stadium on that, on that site, or on those sites rather. It's a big challenge, and it's a challenge that could be met, but it comes with obviously financial implications. And that's something that the city ground, of course, isn't immune to, but it does have flood defenses, and the infrastructure is already there to build upon. Whereas I think when you go somewhere else, you've got to think about who owns the land. How do you acquire the land? Some of the industrial estates I've seen mentioned, great though they might be, because they have a tram stop at the end of them and better bus links, etc., etc. But you're talking about moving potentially hundreds of businesses off an industrial estate. Where do they go to? These are all realistic questions. We don't understand the site constraints of those. So it's not as simple as just, picking up a plan and saying, oh, it fits there, so I think we should go there. Whilst that is, they're valid opportunities to explore, we also have to bear in mind that it's not as simple as just picking up a plan and saying it fits there. I've seen Eastcroft Incinerator and that site mentioned, the Island Quarter, etc. If we look at the Eastcroft site, that's a major Nottingham City Council depot. They run a lot of their operations from there, and the incinerator, I believe, is powering a couple of thousand homes and a district heating system. So it's not a simple case of, oh, we'll just demolish the incinerator and plonk a stadium there. Yes, it could be done, but at what cost and complexity? Whereas my view is the City Ground has a stadium on it. We know it works. We know there are challenges. And I think we should be asking those questions. How do we make it work? Not why won't it work? And putting up reasons for that. So if we go to the next slide, this was a view underneath the third tier, so the rake of the third tier, overlooking the Trent, and there was an idea for a terrace that wraps the entirety of that portion of the stadium, and again capitalizes on views over the Trent towards the city. And Nottingham is a city with a fantastic skyline, but I often criticize the fact we don't really have many roof terraces. We don't have many places to go up and have a drink or some dinner and actually enjoy the city from high level. And when you go to other major cities, there are plenty. It's almost a case of which one do I go to, rather than where is there one. And so this would be one of many occasions where you could create an instance like that, and it'd be fantastic, on a match day. But also, again, is another opportunity for the club to make money as part of match day experiences and use for other events throughout the week, etc. So if we go to the final, which I believe is an aerial overview, that just gives an idea of how the stadium may work. And I have to say that, it's a high level sketch. It would need a lot of resolution, and it probably wouldn't look like this, and the plan might change, and this is a lot bigger stadium. So, you can caveat the life out of it, but it's a shopping list of ideas. And I truly believe that they should be explored. If you look at the point there where the pontoon is coming out and the towpath, you can see the junction is fairly close, the interface between the stadium and the edge of that. But that's not how it would be built in reality. That would be a colonnade, and that would open up and have a concourse underneath the tier, as I described before. And maybe the towpath wouldn't look like that. It would have a different shape, etc., to accommodate all of those constraints. But the key point is here, I think these ideas need to be explored in detail. Height is obviously always an issue wherever you go. I think I would remind people that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west and follows a southerly path. So the stadium casts a shadow into the Trent, and it's only in the late evening, early afternoon, where that shadow starts to cast back onto the residential properties to the south of the stadium. And there are average daylight factors and acceptable levels of daylight, all of which are surveyed in any proposal. And I would remind people that the Peter Taylor stand, which to the height of its structure, I believe is about 38 meters and got successful planning permission granted a couple of years ago, stands to that height. And the surveys indicate that it wouldn't have a significant impact. And if we were to look at building up what is now the Bridgeford stand, and in that proposal would be a main stand, if you like, running the length of the pitch, we could also look at sinking the first tier. Herzog and de Moran did that at Chelsea. Part of the Trent end is already sunk, so you've got the museum under the Trent end, etc., etc. So there are all these different technical opportunities we can explore. And I think that sort of brings to a close the renders that I produce as a high level vision.
Wow. I mean, there's so much to think about and so much to digest. I think the first question that springs to my mind is how straightforward, not how straightforward is it, because we know it'd be difficult, but if we think about, one idea would be to redevelop what we've got already, which is to go back and do the Peter Taylor, do the West Bridgeford stand, and then maybe do something with the corners. That's option one. Option two is to do something like you've just proposed, which is to flatten the current city ground and build in the footprint. And then the third option is to move away to somewhere like Toton or another site. And I guess really we want answers from the club on really what they're thinking. I mean, they're talking about fan consultation being at the heart of what they do. They're talking about nothing happening very, very soon. Tom Cartridge was talking with Matt Davis on Forest Focus about the plans are being thought through, that we're not going to be doing anything probably for the next 6 months or so. Nothing's going to appear out of nowhere. What is the most likely avenue, in your opinion, Matt, that the club are going to go down? I know that you perhaps are only going to give your opinion rather than anything informed, but with all the options on the table between redevelopment, rebuilding, or moving, where do you see it going?
It's a really interesting question, and it's one that, without having an insight on the greater level of detail that none of us are party to, it's a really difficult one to answer. And I know that sounds a bit like a get out, but I'll try and answer it in a way that taps into each of those options. So the first option, I think, has limitations. I think expanding the Bridgeford, when they initially launched the plans back in 2017, whenever it was, 2019, I can't remember, they talked about 38,000. And the reason why the Bridgeford stand drops at one end is because there are houses to the back of it. It would be an extraordinary challenge to try and build that side of the stand up, in my opinion, without going down almost like a compulsory purchase order route and buying houses that they need to buy and trying to get them demolished, etc., would be fraught with difficulty. It's not impossible, but it would be fraught with difficulty. And I think they're probably looking at the Brian Clough and thinking along Anfield Main and thinking, well, that's quite challenging. And so really, is spending 100 million to get 5,000 extra seats really worth it? In my opinion, probably not. A stadium like the one I've designed, if you look at Spurs, that cost over $1 billion. I think Everton's was touted at $500 million. So something like the proposal I've put together isn't going to be cheap. And if you look at a new build stadium elsewhere, I would say that that's going to cost a pretty penny more than any of those options, because it doesn't just stop at the stadium. It's the infrastructure around it. The tram that stops in Toton doesn't actually stop at the site that's being outlined. It would need to be extended. And our trams only have, I think, 5 cars. They're not going to be able to transport 50,000 people there. And I think we have to have questions around sustainability. We need to look forward rather than backwards around issues like parking. Parking's a big one, and I don't want to sort of go off on a big divergence from your question, but I think it's relevant to mention. We shouldn't be encouraging people to drive to football stadiums in 2024. Nottingham is trying to become the UK's first carbon neutral city by 2028. We need to be looking at sustainable modes of transport, whether that's walking, cycling, getting the train, getting the tram, whatever that is. And the location they're currently at enables them to do that. I appreciate that residents have concerns around parking, but that's a parking management issue rather than people traveling by car. That's an issue because you've got people driving from outside of Nottingham trying to park around the stadium. We have to arrive at a solution where they feel discouraged from doing that. And that's about investing in infrastructure. That's about making the train attractive to use at an attractive price, etc., etc. So in answer to your question, which of those three options do I think the club will pursue? I think in the first instance, they should really exhaust what they've got from a sustainable perspective, from a sustainability perspective. The best piece of architecture is the one that's already there. Demolishing a stadium of that size, there's tons of embodied carbon in all the concrete, etc., etc. Of course, we could try and reuse some, as Spurs did in there. When they demolished White Hart Lane, they pumped it into the concourses in the new Spurs stadium. You can look at all of those avenues, and maybe that will happen. But I think that needs to be exhausted. I think we need to look at the Brian Clough and see what can be done there. I think we need to ask questions about the Trent End. It's a relatively new development. It's 34, 35 years old. And filling in the corners and what that looks like. If it were me, I'd be, and I'm sure the club have done this. I think the chairman's indicated on a number of occasions that exercise has been done. But I think it's about getting the right people in the room. As I said before, we've just got a new East Midlands mayor. We're a month or so away from a general election. This could be a big talking point for the region. And these kind of projects affect hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, and they will affect millions of people in this region. This is a seminal project for the region. We have to get this right. And this is where politicians of all different colours need to come in a room, lock the door, and bang heads for a while, and arrive at an agreement where we're not party politicking. It's not black and white. The world is very grey, and we need to arrive at a solution that's the best for the football club, and by way of that, the best for the city and the region. In my personal view, I think they'll look to redevelop what they've got, and I think that would be wise in the first instance. But I think if the housing to the south causes issues, if they can't do what I think would be great to do with the Brian Clough by doing a sort of Anfield Main, if that's infeasible, then I think you do need to look at knocking down and going again on the current site. And I've seen a lot about, where would we play? Where would we play? Well, Meadow Lane, it's 19, 20,000, whatever it is. And yes, there would be a drop in revenue, but it's not a question of revenue for forever. It's a couple of years, and in reality it's essentially a couple of transfer fees. The drop in revenue, the reality is, if you're looking to make money in football, you don't build a new stadium. They're not as big a money earners as is made out. They cost an awful lot of money to build, and they don't actually generate that much revenue. And I think Michael Templeton talks really eloquently on this matter on Forest Focus. I believe he obviously works at Trent Bridge and understands the commerciality behind stadia and sport. And building a stadium is very costly, and the return is not that great. In fact, really, if you want to make money in football and progress the club, then you spend money on players like Murillo that you buy for an absolute bargain fee, and you sell them on to the likes of Real Madrid for 100 million, like the Brighton style model. That's how clubs make money and progress. But I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think that Forest can do both, and I think there are creative ways to look at how we fund this. And I honestly think that a solution can be found to keep the club at the current site. I also think that Mr. Marinakis is a super ambitious owner, and I think you're really lucky to have him on board, because I honestly don't believe he views the club from a commercial perspective. I really don't. Obviously, he's got fantastic business mind, as has the chairman, and their stewardship. For me, the ambition is absolutely there, but he wants to leave a legacy, and he wants to leave a legacy for Nottingham and the people of this region. And that's why I think staying where they are and building again, whatever form that takes, is the right thing to do. And I'm really passionate about the city centre, and I think if you move the city ground, it's almost the death nail in the city centre. The city centre here is hanging on reasonably well compared to some other places in the UK, smaller towns and cities, and it's got a lot going through it. Hockley is a great example. The castle, etc., etc. We've got all these fantastic assets in the city centre, but Broadmarsh is an opportunity for redevelopment. And when you walk through there currently, it's full of empty units, like a lot of places in the UK. Getting a stadium up to this capacity on the city ground, a mile or two away from the city centre, for me, is the absolute best case scenario to regenerate our city. And I think moving it 6-7 miles away will just rip the heart out of the city. And that's why I'm so passionate about keeping it there.
Well, we completely agree.
Yeah.
Ian's asking if we were to go with flattening and rebuilding something like you've designed, how long would that take? And Meadow Lane is the obvious place to go. I agree with that. How long would we have to play there for, do you think?
Well, I think we have to be realistic. I think a lot of people forget sometimes the timeline that goes before a spade is even put in the ground. For something like this, I think the chairman indicated in his interview that it might not be Benoit delivering a new build stadium. It might be a populace, let's just say, for argument's sake. That design team would need to be assembled. Project of this size, you're going to have maybe 30, 40 different consultants, if not more, across the field of construction engineering and beyond. There would be a program to take it to planning. There would be a very lengthy, heated planning process. And that's not just on the city ground site, by the way, that goes for anywhere. And that's if you do anything to the current city ground, as the current Peter Taylor stands experience. If you rebuild as per sort of my vision, or you go somewhere else, it's gonna take a long time to get it through the planning process. That's the reality of it. Then you've got the actual build, and I toyed with the idea of Spurs sort of built half the horseshoe of the new stadium behind White Hart Lane, decanted to Wembley. Now, I mean, my goodness me, if you're decanting to Wembley, it's a blessing. But Wembley's not very near Nottingham. Meadow Lane is across the road. I think in terms of how long it would take, I think you'd be looking at probably 3 seasons, if I'm being brutally honest. And that's being ambitious. But where there's a will, there's a way. Maybe some temporary measures need to be looked at Meadow Lane, and I'll get some stick for saying this, but Notts County are a fantastic club and asset to this region as well. And by way of the privilege of having Premier League football that Forest do, if they're helping a local club, I also don't see that as a bad thing. Many Forest players in the academy have gone and spent seasons on loan at County. They often play each other in the pre-season. Yeah, there's a bit of local rivalry, of course, that's football, but we're in this together, and we need to view this as football fans, and what's beneficial for the city. So, if Forest contribute in some way to, some sort of temporary provision at the county ground, or a permanent addition of extra capacity, I don't know. That we need to explore those opportunities as well. But I think you would be looking at least 3 seasons, and that would be on quite an expedient program. But it can be done. It's been done in the past. I mean, I'm not one for advocating the way other countries do their business, and we have a very rigorous planning process, rightly so, in this country, and our construction industry is very heavily regulated, rightly so. But elsewhere in Europe, they do build things more quickly than us. Sometimes we enjoy a lot of bureaucracy here, and there is an argument to say we just need to kind of put the speed boosters behind this, and that's where it comes back to political will. If the right political wind is behind this, and all the parties aren't party politicking and they're all agreeing, then this could be done in a timely manner. And if the right design team are assembled, it's possible that it could be done probably within 5 to 6 years, if you were to push the green button tomorrow. But that's ambitious. And I think the chairman indicated that in his interview this morning, that, the Peter Taylor stand is probably going to be shelved and they're having a rethink. Planning applications expire anyway after a certain number of years. So that has a shelf life as well. So that's my view. I think, it's going to take 2 to 3 seasons minimum, probably more likely 3+. But at the end of the day, in 5 or 6 years' time, 5 years ago, nearly, we were on the brink of a pandemic. And here we are 5 years later. And the world has changed. And yes, it does feel different. But 5 years has flown by. And if at the end of another 5 years, you've got a 50,000-seater stadium on the banks of the Trent, which is the envy of the football world, then I think that's worth it, personally.
We couldn't agree more. We think your vision looks magnificent. It really caught our imagination as soon as we saw it. And to have you come on to Talking Reds to really give us a proper presentation of what the new City Ground really could be. And yes, we know that it is ambitious, and we know that it, as you say, is a shopping list. And anything that did happen to spring up in that footprint could look very different. But what I would say, and I really don't want you to feel like I'm just saying this because you're here. If anyone from the club is ever watching this, I hope they reach out to you and at least have a conversation with you, because your passion and your vision and your love for the city is evident as someone who, you say you're a Fulham fan, but I think I know Forest fans with less passion about the city than you. So it's truly heartwarming to hear everything you've got to say. And anyone listening, I think would certainly agree. The clamour to stay at the City Ground or stay in that location is so important. Everyone wants that. So we hope that that's what will happen. And we want to thank you for joining us on Talking Reds today. Okay, right. We've just gone past an hour. If you're watching this, we do hope that you will like and subscribe and watch along on following episodes coming up in the future. You can find us on X, which is formerly Twitter. We're on TikTok as well. So we also wanted to do something a bit more light-hearted. So with that in mind, it's time for this.
The lightning round!
Yeah, just a little homage to our favorite television show, Friends. I'm not sure if you're a Friends fan, Matt, but hopefully you are. If you're not, that's okay too. But we got a couple of questions. We got a few questions here. So you got about 5 minutes, 10 questions, just to get a little insight. Some of these are probably not going to resonate with you because they're more Forest oriented for, where the Forest is your number one club. But what was your first Forest match live? I think we talked a little bit about what you've seen previously, but yeah, give us your first Forest match live.
Well, I think it was actually in a pub in West Bridgford, the test match, and I was there with my fellow friend, and it was a fairly unremarkable match. It was under Houghton, I'm afraid. So I actually can't remember. I think the one that sticks in the mind from a live perspective is actually when I was in the Trent Navigation and the playoff final. That was just a fantastic day, and the city was just electric. And even though I'm not a Forest fan, I was just so happy for you all. I felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from your shoulders.
That's great. Yeah, I don't think any of us can forget that day for sure. I think I was at work. It's actually at work. Should have been working, but I was watching the match, crying my eyes out as they won, of course. Let's go with this question. You're required to spend one day with a fan from a team you dislike, despise. What team would that be?
I don't think I dislike or despise any team. I think as a Fulham fan, we have in our club, we have a view that Chelsea are our biggest rivals. I don't think Chelsea fans view us in that way, but it's fantastic when on the rare occasion when we have beaten Chelsea, and it's always a bit of banter between the two clubs. So yeah, I'd happily spend a day with a Chelsea fan. I've got some in my family, but I'd happily spend a day and debate Fulham and Chelsea, and I'd love to see it become a more solid derby than it currently is.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, what about now? Granted, this is talking about Forest. We could go Fulham too, right? So if your club could sign one player from a non-top 6 side, who would that be? I know Greg likes Dominic Solanke, which I think we'd all agree with. So what about you?
Yeah, I think I had Solanke on the mind as well. I said to my dad last summer, I really hope we go in for Solanke. I think he's an absolutely great player. And I say this and I'm going to get some stick for this, but, you know, I think Paulinho is just unbelievable for Fulham. He's so good. And he's just been fantastic for us, and we almost lost him to Bayern in January. And I'm so thankful we're keeping him,
except for the first half at the City Ground this season. When he was when we had his number, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, for me, you know, I'd be looking at him.
Well, we'll try to see if you can answer this question, because you probably do, knowing what you've talked about with the club and your history and your awareness of the history of the club and that reverence that you have for it. What about a player in Forest history would you like to see on the current squad?
Well, it's interesting because I didn't see these two players play, but I've watched back videos of them, and my dad talks so fondly of them both. The first one is Stan Collymore. I just think of the videos I've seen of him playing, him as a person. He just embodies everything Forest, I think. And I think he's an Aston Villa fan, isn't he? But you can see how much the club means to him. But I think without a shadow of a doubt, it's got to be Piercy for me. I've been to a couple of events in the city where Stuart Pearce has been a guest speaker, and, you know, he's a fellow Londoner as well. But I mean, he was Forest, wasn't he, for the years that he was at the club. I think when he stood in front of the Trent End and the Psycho chant, etc., I just think he was everything that was great about Forest in those days. So I personally would bring back Piercy.
Yeah, I don't know anybody else in that I've talked to that doesn't bring him up first, right? I mean, that was Greg and I have talked quite a bit about this, but that's been my most emblazoned memory, is that chant, hearing that. I mean, what a great name. If you usually label somebody that, you might have concerns about them, right? But when it comes to him being called Psycho, it's just the most brilliant nickname and the most brilliant player. I absolutely love the guy. He's my favorite player of all time by
One to add to that, actually, in recent times, and I'm probably going to get some stick for this as well, but I'd have Jed Spence back. I thought he was just so brilliant for you. I really did. And I just loved his mum's passion for the club. When he got promoted, there were advertisements all over the city, and I don't know who was putting them out, actually, of his mother leaning over the stand celebrating every time he scored. And it's just, Jed Spence was fantastic that season for me. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's great. No, and it's a hot topic right now, right? With him leaving Tottenham again, so it's perfectly timed. Sorry, I was a little premature throwing this up here, but your favorite away or third kit? You could go Forest. I mean, Greg's wearing mine, which I appreciate. He's got that fantastic third kit from 2022, I think, right? So last year, yeah. So what about you? You could say Fulham too, but just curious if you're familiar with the kits.
Yeah, the Barton's bus seat one that you're wearing, I've got to confess, I actually bought one of those because I just thought that is iconic. I don't think it got enough outings or respect, but I think that will go down. And I remember people slating it online, I think, when it first came out. But I thought, you guys are going to look back in 20 years and they'll be on eBay for $2,000 because it's just iconic, instantly iconic. I think Matt Davies mentioned the sort of Nottingham City Council, the orange and yellow one. I think just because of the luck you had in that kit, I think that was an iconic one. My knowledge beyond recent history is probably quite poor. I've seen some in the club shop. I do love the older yellow, I think it's yellow, red and black Labatt's with the sort of unusual pattern over the
graffiti one.
Yeah, that is glorious. And controversially, I think I read somewhere that the owner has a bit of a superstition about the colour green. But there's another Labatt's one in the club shop whenever you go in there that's all green. And I just think, with Forest, trees, Forest, etc., Nottingham, County, Country Parks, I think the green one, the Labatt's one is a classic as well.
Yeah, I think, Greg, we were throwing around, or somebody was throwing around on Twitter, or X rather, a green one, a concept version for next season that's green and it has like gold lettering. It's pretty stunning, I'd have to say. So I like that idea. Absolutely. Thank you. So what is the one thing, and you could say this for Fulham again, but for Forest in particular, for us, what is the one thing you would give up for a year that you see as essential to see Forest or your club win the Premier League? So something like you have to drink lukewarm water and nothing else for an entire year, which I don't have any idea if I could do that, but maybe you can do that. So something like that, or your phone, or something really, really essential to your daily life.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what is really essential. I mean, obviously I couldn't give up anything that sort of stops me doing my day job. I would happily take a really bland food every single day. I'm not sure how that would affect my health, probably terribly, but a really bland food for every meal, providing it doesn't kill me, of course. But just something with no flavor, like a boring broth that has all the nutrients I need to stay alive. I would happily enjoy that for every meal, including breakfast, to see either of you win, and Fulham, of course, win the Premier League. I think it would just be fantastic. And actually, on that note, my best experience as a Fulham fan was, which is often forgotten, I must say, and I'm just going to use this opportunity to remind people that we got to a European final in 2010. We played in Hamburg against Atletico Madrid, and I was fortunate enough to go with my dad, and it was probably the best and worst experience of my life. I don't think I've ever cried so much after anything. But the fact that we got there to the final against all odds, I think, again, is one of those stories for, let's just say smaller clubs in the Premier League or mid-table clubs in the Premier League, that it can be done, and to have that ambition.
That's great. I appreciate it. That's a great answer. Yep. Thank you. Thank you for playing Lightning Round.
Okay, we are running out of time, and so wanted to bring you some of the latest news and have a quick word on some of that. So in the last 24 hours, the big and kind of news out of on the transfer zone is that there are more clubs coming in or looking at Callum Hudson-Odoi. He obviously has had a great season for Forest, certainly the back end, scoring what seemed like a copy and paste goal every week with that right foot cutting in. So he now seems to be attracting attention. And yesterday I popped out onto Twitter something along the lines of that we shouldn't be accepting anything less than 25 million. On reflection, that price is perhaps a little bit low. We did have a few people responding to that. Richard said that the annoying thing is that everyone knows he's going to explode next season, so they're going to try and get him before his value skyrockets. I mean, that is fairly true, I imagine. We also had one from McTricky saying, to be fair, if Brennan was 40 plus, then 25 is possibly too low. He's been at a top club already. Unlike Brennan, he has proved his fitness, desire, and ability to get back. He's still young, and selling Callum would be disappointing. But if we could get 40 million, then, that's not a bad fee. Niall says the issue is apparently Chelsea get 50% of the fee. So that would be quite worrying. So 25 million means only 12.5 for us. So, yeah, we'd want to try and maximize that transfer fee. And Lee says, what we paid is irrelevant. He's the same age as Brennan again. Someone talking about that. He had more impact this season with his goals. Even 25 to 30 million, too low. Something 45 million above. What do you think about Callum Hudson-Odoi and potentially leaving the club, Richard?
I think that would be based off his late season form in particular, like you mentioned, I mean, he didn't play as many matches as I thought he did. I mean, if it's 20 games and he got 8 goals, it's pretty remarkable. But I would say if it helps stave off potentially losing, not that I don't want to say Callum Hudson's critical or important to our cause, but at the same time, if it staves off losing a Gibbs White, for example, I think you have to make that sacrifice. There are other players out there. He's got some pedigree, obviously, with his time at Chelsea. He's played fantastic, obviously, from what we've seen, especially in the latter half of the season. But I would also say there's guys out there like Jonathan Rowe, for example, at Norwich City that might be a good replacement. So I think we have to look at that seriously, knowing what our PSR situation, and know that we want to keep Morgan at the club to be that centerpiece.
Yeah. And in fact, one club that were possibly in competition for Callum last summer were Fulham, Matt. So he, at one point, I thought he was going to go to Fulham, staying in London. He wouldn't have had to move. I was a little bit surprised that we got him. I think it was definitely the Cooper connection that got Callum Hudson over the line to Forest, and we've definitely benefited. What's your view on Callum Hudson-Odoi, Matt?
I think he's excellent, and I say that as someone who, speaking from a level head position, Fulham have benefited a lot from former Chelsea players. Willian being the obvious one. I think everyone had written Willian off, and he's actually probably one of our best players, if not our best player, when he's on his day. I think Callum is another one of those players that probably slipped off the boil, and it seems to happen a lot at Chelsea. They bring a lot of talented players in, and they have a lot of talent in their ranks, and it just sort of fades away. Another one that springs to mind is Ola Aina. He was also at Fulham. I believe the season we sadly got relegated, but he was excellent for us then, and I think he's been one of your best players as well. Personally, I think if you're letting Callum go, it needs to be for a substantial fee. I actually think he is one of your best players. When he cuts in and scores, it just reminds me of Iron Robin. He's excellent, and I saw it live because I saw him punish us. And yeah, I just think you'd be mad to let him go without finding a suitable replacement. He's a bit, for me, he's like Morgan Gibbs-White and Murillo. They're absolutely essential to your team.
Yeah, I think we want to try and keep him. We've got 2 years on the contract still. Speaking of Ola Aina, he had his year extended by the club, and Willy Bolly has also signed a new contract as well with an option for a second. I would have liked to have seen Ola Aina's contract lengthened already. Maybe they'll just activate the extension and look to renegotiate as well. But he definitely was a standout player. Hampered a bit by the odd injury and also going off to AFCON. But in the run-in for us, he certainly was one of our better players. The rumours around Nuno Espirito Santo are thick and fast coming out of social media. The Fiorentina manager, Vincenzo Italiano, has been linked to the club. He, of course, goes into the Europa Conference League final against Olympiacos. So it will be interesting to keep an eye on developments there. And Kieran Maguire, the financial expert, he is saying, or has been saying in the newspaper this week, that we are in danger of potentially breaching PSR again and could see another points deduction coming our way. So that, again, goes back to selling players, making sure that by the 30th of June, we have met the requirements to stay within the rules. We don't have time to go into it too much now, but my initial thoughts are that another PSR breach would be not a good thing for the club, clearly, but more so because all of the off-field distractions this season have been such a problem that we need to get away from having those kind of things happening again at the club. So one more thing we want to talk about before we go as well is the Tom Cartledge interview with Matt Davis on Forest Focus. I know we've spent a lot of time on the stadium, but we've all seen the interview. What's your initial reaction overall, Richard, to what Tom had to say? Just very quickly, he talked about the very ambitious owners, Mr. Marinakis, he kept saying how ambitious he is. I know, Matt, you were talking about that as well. He was talking about how much the revenue has grown for the club in the last 7 years, and how the 85% can be spent under the new financial rules coming in. So in a year's time or so, the rules will change. We can spend 85% of our revenue. So having an enhanced revenue to start with means that we can do more for the club. He talked about the fact that all Forest fans should be excited. He clearly backs himself as well with his own design ambition and his own design background. So overall, there's lots to kind of unpick. We don't have time to go into it in too much detail, Richard, but what were your overall thoughts of what he had to say with Matt?
Yeah, I mean, he's, as expected, he's a bit cloak and dagger about a number of different topics, right? But he's not going to give up anything on that. But ultimately, it was, I guess, refreshing, if I can use that phrase, to him to say that they're still clearly open to the idea of what like Matt's presenting with his design option and potential. So that's good to hear. I mean, that's good to hear that it's not like, I don't even know if he would really even commit to this, but a done deal that they're moving away from Nottingham in any way. So that's good. That was a good thing to hear that. I was a little bit perturbed at moments just personally with this notion that they care a lot about the fans. And then there's obviously some things that have happened this year, which we won't get into because we don't have the time, probably a little bit worn out on it as well. That seemed a little bit contrary to what's actually occurred. But outside of that, I thought it was really insightful in a lot of ways. I think you can clearly see he cares about the city. He cares about the club. His family's connected to it. So that was all refreshing, all enlightening from an overall perspective. And
Matt, just briefly, what did you think?
I think the chairman and the owners have a very difficult decision to make, and it's a very complex issue around the stadium. And I'm just going to focus my minute or so on the stadium. I think whatever's decided, I genuinely believe that they will be doing it with the best intentions of the club in mind. And I know that fans won't like to hear that. And I'm hopeful that they explore expanding what they've got, or rebuilding on the current site, or rebuilding close. But if it has to move out, then I think they will have exhausted all options first, and there will be sound reasons behind why they have decided to do that. And as I said before, it's very easy to draw a site plan and plonk a stadium on, but there are lots of complex factors that go into making that happen. It's not a case of whether it fits on a site and who owns it and whether you can acquire it. It's multifaceted, and the issues around stadia increase tenfold because they're such complex beasts. So yes, I hope they explore it. If matters change and circumstances change, I just think they need to be really clear with the fans as to why they're doing what they're doing. And hopefully, respectfully, people can come on board with whatever they do, because it's in the best interests of the city that we get this right.
Well, that takes us to the end. Thank you so much. If you've been watching, we do hope that you will like and subscribe and continue to watch us on future episodes as well. You can find us on TikTok. You can find us on Twitter. Richard, thank you very much indeed today.
Oh, thank you. It was an absolute pleasure, Matt, to have you on and to be able to get to know you a little bit and have that conversation. Thank you.
Likewise. Yeah. Thank you so much, chaps, for having me on. And like I say, I'm doing this out of pure love for the city, and I just want the best for the city. And it's not to tread on anyone's toes or gain something personally out of it. It's purely out of love for the city, and I want what's best for the people that live here.
Hear, hear. Matt, you're a gentleman. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you can join us again next time on Talking Reds. In the meantime, we'll see you next time.